discussion possible. Marxism for Ernest Gellner was a challenge of the day, in effect of all his life. Although his philosophy, his first and last book, seem not as parts of this challenge, all his politics and thinking was marked by taking Marxism seriously, as a contender for primacy and major opponent of the liberal theory of modernity. For Gellner, Marxism was an alternative theory of modernity, and even though he paid a lot of attention to Islam as well, I do not think that Islam, understood broadly as a life strategy, was really perceived by him as a candidate for a future order in at least the Euro-Atlantic space. As I quoted him in the abstract which you have, Gellner always knew that Marxism was a set of beliefs which were untrue, which deserved respect only as an alternative religion. His former colleague in Cambridge, Chris Hahn, stressed that Gellner rejected Marxism for its economic determinism, but that at the same time Gellner, I quote, emphasized a materialist standpoint, and this Central European is painfully aware that decent human communities require stronger social foundations than those which liberal individualism has been able to provide, unquote. Gellner, if I may say, believed in an unbiased, falsifiable quest for knowledge as the decisive characteristics of humankind. That is, man for him is a knowledge-seeking species, which believes that beliefs are beliefs which differ fundamentally from scientific knowledge. History is neither history of class struggle nor of national conflict, he wrote in his last fully accomplished book on nationalism, published 1997. In a collection published just few years before Nationalism, that is Encounters with Nationalism, don't accuse me of breaching copyright. I have made a copy like this. He was more concrete. I quote, Marxism distinguishes, and he emphasized, various types of class-endowed society. It is we post-Marxist sociologists who bring together all agrarian societies in one great genus, contrasted with the industrial world, unquote. Gellner's relation to Marxism is, however, ambivalent and more colorful than black and white. After all, Gellner lived 9/10 of his active academic life with Marxism allegedly ruling in a large part of the world and expanding into less developed ex-colonial world. Arguably, the best of Gellner's books, Plough, Sword and Book, is subtitled The Structure of Human History, and thus is a response to the dogmatics of Marxist historical materialism. Here I refer to Jiří Musil, who, by the way, sends you greetings, those who know him. I saw him before yesterday, and he regretted he couldn't join us here. But his article about Plough, Sword and Book is included into one of the collections I brought here for your attention. Unfortunately, it must be bought if you want to acquire it. His guru here is Max Weber, who stressed ideology as a major ingredient of capitalism. However, neither Weber nor Gellner wanted to discount the role of production. Gellner wrote of Weber that there is no question of his intending, this is quote, to replace a materialist account by some kind of idealist negation or inversion of it. The most, he claimed, was that the indispensable material preconditions were to be supplemented by a further additional ideological one, without which, on their own, the material or structural causes would not have sufficed to produce the required result. That's a quote from Gellner about Weber. What Weber really changed in the theory of history, which was his transcendence of Marxist and Hegelian stress on endogenous nature of historical process. Again, quote from Gellner, Weberianism most emphatically does not assume or postulate that all past social forms contain the later forms as seeds. Capitalism was not, for Max Weber, the inevitable fruit of the internal contradictions of some generic pre-capitalist social formation. The really important difference lies in the fact that this approach does not assume that all pre-capitalist class-endowed social formations to be inherently unstable, nor does it see them as located along some permanent evolutionary ladder. Unquote. Western historical theory, unlike Marxism, worked with, again a quote from Gellner, the absence of a faith in a persistent and, as it were, internal mechanism of change propelling human society in a specific direction. Unquote. To this, what he inherited from Weber, Gellner adds that what Marxism underscored in its theory was that what Marxism overestimated in its practice, and that is coercion. Whereas Marxism relegated politics into superstructure, Gellner thinks must be part of infrastructure. Marxism, argues Gellner, devalued the political in favor of forces of production. This is the most critical point where Marxism failed, according to Gellner. That is also why Marxist orthodoxy did not and could not count with the Asiatic mode of production, whether it existed or not, because it was stagnant and overtly politically coercive. Gellner reminds his readers that besides ideas and production, there is another moving factor, coercion, that is political sphere. Marxism denies primacy of to politics and puts what Gellner called forces of coercion into the so-called superstructure and not among the forces of production. There, according to Gellner, lies the crux of the misunderstanding, in quotes, between Marxists and non-Marxists. The latter, the non-Marxists, tend to view coercion as part of the material, along with economic forces. He rightly explains that the problem which the Soviet Marxists saw in the purported existence of a sixth Asiatic mode of production, sixth formation, was exactly that it was, I quote, a social order which contradicts not merely the crucial Marxist thesis of the inherent instability of class-endowed societies, but also the view that power and coercion are parts of the superstructure. The Asiatic mode of production characterizes a society in which the political rulers do not reflect the interests of a pre-existent, economically defined class. The soldiers and bureaucrats who rule, administer, and enforce a hydraulic social order are themselves its beneficiaries and only come into being with it, Gellner emphasizes. Here Gellner raises the question of the very foundation of Marxism, which views political power as, I quote, the mere handmaiden of pre-existing economic classes and coercive mechanisms in society as a part of superstructural reflection. There he sees an interesting overlap with the contemporary Western idealism, which appears under the names such as hermeneutics, semantic, and one should haste to add postmodernism. These new directions in Western thought work with meanings as their basic concepts, which are integral part of languages and culture. So the causal consequences or generalizations are not that interesting or important, but rather the meaning systems should be explained because they allegedly direct human behavior. Gellner, however, didn't say a word about his previous pastime of his studies of Soviet ethnographia, and that is, of course, his hobby in reconstructing the beginnings of the human society. Before we could, but we probably would not, turn to topics where Marxist, before we turn to this Soviet stuff, which I think I will not manage, we would look at the questions of civil society. Gellner, I contend, didn't write his Conditions of Liberty, this famous book which was already discussed by Alan, just because he wanted to paraphrase or improve on Popper. He wanted, to my mind, to make a point about Marxism. It was the practical Marxism, so to say the really existing socialism, which suppressed pluralism of civil society. At the same time, Marxism, while repeating empty slogans about the withering of the state, made state a very central, omnipresent and omnipotent behemoth, which, as Gellner aptly wrote, I quote, tolerated no rivals, unquote. Civil society emerged as a potent rival, and Gellner hastened to remind us that to Marxism, civil society must have appeared as a fraud, I quote, a facade for a hidden and maleficent domination, unquote. So both the state and civil society, I quote, are damned as redundant and fraudulent, unquote. The practice of socialism, as we know, was a failure. The attempts to liberalize it, improve it morally, or remove its so-called deformations were not successful. Gellner's Civil Society book was written to prove that Marxism was wrong because there was no better taming device for states' inherent totalitarian tendencies than civil society. It is civil society, in Gellner's rendering, that, I quote, prevents the establishment of monopoly of power and truth, unquote, does not allow what Gellner called Caesaro-papism, Mamonism, and other types of nomenclatura. At worst, it appeared to Gellner, fared Russia with its, I quote, imposition of Marxism on Byzantine theology and traditions, unquote. The result was the demise of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a badly felt need to resurrect the society taken by the plague of reproduction of the system which, I quote from Gellner, created isolated, amoral, cynical, individualists without opportunity, skilled at double talk and trimming within the system, but incapable of effective enterprise, unquote. The gist of the book is not only to reveal why Marxism failed and Islamic Ummah succeeded, at least for the time being, I would add. It shows why civil society is so essential for those who suffered or still suffer under the spell of state totalitarianism. It also shows that democracy is also a slogan like civil society, but perhaps less powerful, because it is easily falsifiable by its own mechanics. For sheer existence of majority vote might suppress, for sheer exercise of majority vote might suppress the sole person who is right, but receives no votes. In civil society, at least, this isolated but right voice can and should be heard better. Conditions of liberty is a timely word against the void created by the disintegration of the Marxist world now deprived of the faith in its central doctrine. And I quote from Gellner, thugs and humbugs as mediators of the other world are tolerated. Sleazy mediocrities, meaning the Brezhnev period especially, as agents of the apotheosis of this world are not. Unquote. The solution appears to Gellner as the international of consumerist unbelievers. It's one of his beautiful phrases. Committed, I quote, to a pragmatic and pluralist pursuit of wealth, unquote. And civil society, in which polity, I quote, and economy are distinct, where polity is instrumental but can and doles check extremes of individual interests, but where the state in turn is checked by institutions with an economic base. It relies on economic growth, which, by requiring cognitive growth, makes ideological monopoly impossible. Unquote. Now, a small section, if I may still use a little time, section called Neither Class Nor Nation, Nationalism. The well-known discussion of the work of Miroslav Hroch, unfortunately not present here, is very important, not because of the question whether Hroch was or was not a Marxist, but because of the question what were the forces which brought about modernity. Are these class contradictions of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, as Hroch believes, or, as Gellner argues, the earlier, it is stressed, earlier structural changes within European society, when absolutist society engendered secular bureaucracy and pushed church to the background, where centralized polity linked itself with, I quote, a literate, normative, codified high culture. Unquote. The logic of Hroch's argument leads to what Gellner called phenomenology of nationalism, which in turn leads Hroch into a dilemma. In Gellner's words, quote, it is nations, or is it classes? Or is it nations, or is it classes, which are the real and principal actors of history, question mark, unquote. For Hroch, it is, I quote, the conception of the nation as a constituent of social reality of historical origin, which is opposed to, I quote, the subjectivist deception of the nation as the product of nationalism, national will, and spiritual forces, unquote, which is, as is known, basically Gellner's position. Hroch admits that his generalizing procedures are derived from the Marxist conception of historical development, but actually, as Gellner stressed, end up in what Gellner calls basic social ontology, where origin of the modern nations is to be found rather than in the historical structural change. Thus, Gellner brands Hroch's approach as semi-Marxist. And a quotation supports that. Nations do have an independent and irreducible existence, and nonetheless, the main historical reality remains the change in class relations postulated by Marxism, unquote. Gellner summarized his position on Hroch in these words. The work of Miroslav Hroch represents a remarkable attempt to superimpose the Marxist and nationalist visions of history on each other. History is the account of changing class relations, and yet the independent reality of nations is also conceded and affirmed. Moreover, he brings to his aid a wealth of historical and sociological documentation, and the case must be taken seriously by someone who, like myself, says Gellner, accepts neither of these two visions. What I would stress here is that both class and nationalist options are visions for Gellner, not scientifically proven theories. This he further develops in his discussion of Sporluck's discussion of Marx and List, Marxian thesis on class struggle as the essence of history is refuted by both Sporluck and Gellner. Gellner reminds Marxism of its own idea that class struggle is there, or was there, only temporarily. It was not there before, it will be not there after. But Gellner is careful not to make impression that he would accept, I quote, the doctrine that a genuinely classless society is feasible, unquote, but he instead stresses, I quote, the way in which society divides its members into subgroups is subject to radical change, unquote. Class struggle, again a quote, is in no way inscribed into the eternal nature and order of things, unquote. Gellner crowns this discussion with the assertion which defeats both Marxist teleology and historicist evolutionist approach as such. Yeah. There is no valid justification, I quote from Gellner, for any one social order, and no balance of power underlying a given order is permanent, unquote. Thus, that what he calls social metaphysics in Marxism is, I quote, a very curious mixture of individualist anarchism and a pan-human communalism, unquote. The substance of the Marxist vision is what Gellner characterized as realization of species being in the liberation of the constraints imposed on humanity by membership in class, ethnic or religious categories, and indeed by any social roles, which will climax in a harmonious universal community. These are Gellner's words. Gellner wonders about, I quote him here, nature of the hidden hand which is to perform this miracle, unquote, because the founding fathers of Marxism didn't specify on this point. What is obvious to Gellner is Marxist wishful thinking, which excludes nations and classes, and he adds religion, from true human essence, so-called true human essence. However, Marxism, according to Gellner, doesn't admit that history is the history of national struggles. Why Gellner invoked Sporluck and List is precisely because, I quote, List was right and Marx wrong, unquote, because Friedrich List, a German economist and the author of less known but all the more important book, The National System of Political Economy, Das Nationale System der Politischen Ökonomie, 1841, was able to explain why nationalism is the result and concomitant of economic modernization, rather than class or cultural antagonisms. This, of course, is water on Gellner's mill, for Gellner's theory of nationalism rests on modernity and industrialism as its main ingredients. I think that here Gellner distanced himself very clearly from Marxism, which appears to him not only wrong factually, but also as a visionary utopianism. I'm now coming to our colleague, Michael Lesnov, but I'll then skip that because he is here and he can maybe say some words himself. I also skipped the discussion of Soviet Marxist ethnography and its theories, which Gellner so much liked to discuss about, because it's also in one of the books, the blue one on the left, which you can acquire. And I conclude. I call it, is a conclusion possible, instead of saying conclusion. At the risk of simplifying, I would contend that Ernest Gellner did not consider Marxism as a viable theory of social organization and societal reorganization. He witnessed at first hand both the power and the demise of the Soviet-type state totalitarianism, both the sleazy decadence and Gorbachev era of partly naive perestroika and glasnost. He recognized, but not analyzed, the escape route of China, Vietnam, or even Cuba, but not North Korea, via accelerated economic growth without much political relaxation of communist superstructure. His main concern, however, was with the particular aspects of Marxist theory, be it primitive communism, Asiatic mode of production, feudalism, transition to capitalism with nations and nationalism, accompanying it, ending with the question of the projected withering of the state. On all counts, eventually, Gellner seemed to out-argue Marxism, both Soviet and Western, by his theory of history, nationalism, and politics. However, in some minor points, he conceded that Marxism had its logic and historical role to play. It is now on us to discover flaws in his social theory, in Gellner's social theory. If he lived, Gellner would be delighted to see some of his points resisting criticism, but equally delighted when his conclusions would not survive colleagues' critique. For he was a good Popperian, and as such he championed falsification of theories in the atmosphere of open society. Thank you very much.